Kimi Antonelli may have just revealed the one detail that could completely change Ferrari's season. Because if what Antonelli said is right, Ferrari are not just hanging around the fight, they could be lining up the one engine step that pulls them back toward Mercedes. And the twist is, while Ferrari may be about to get help, Red Bull could be stuck watching it happen without getting the same opportunity. So this isn't just another paddock rumor. This could decide whether the championship turns into a real multi-team fight later in the year. Before we get into that Antonelli claim, there are a few important updates from around the paddock that help explain the bigger picture. Ferrari are part of fresh Pirelli testing activity linked to wet weather running, with the sport still trying to figure out what racing in bad conditions is really going to look like under these newer regulations. There's a growing push to move away from the full wet and toward a stronger intermediate style solution that can cover more conditions. And honestly, that tells you everything about how little confidence there still is in the current wet weather package. Ferrari are right in the middle of that conversation. And with more testing scheduled involving other teams as well, this is one of those quieter stories that could matter a lot later on. There was also a smaller Ferrari-linked story involving Jack Doohan, with talk that he has apparently received a Ferrari WEC offer. At the same time, there's continued chatter that some drivers are already looking beyond the current Formula One experience and considering other categories. Liam Lawson has been mentioned in that conversation too. And when you put all of that together, Max wanting to race elsewhere, other drivers exploring side opportunities, and general frustration with these regulations, it paints a picture of a grid that is not exactly in love with where things are heading. Then there was a lighter paddock moment, with Fernando Alonso's newborn son receiving a paddock pass. It's one of those fun side stories that always travels well in F1 media. But even that sits inside a wider atmosphere where teams and drivers are constantly feeding the news cycle while the bigger technical battles keep building in the background. And another point that matters here, there is now broad agreement across the paddock that qualifying needs work. Team bosses and key figures are increasingly aligned that the sport needs to move qualifying back towards something more straightforward and more aggressive. That meeting in London is going to matter, because even the teams who have benefited most don't sound particularly happy with the current state of it. Now here's where the real story starts. The 2026 performance picture is not just about who has the best engine. It's also about who actually got their car down to the right weight and who didn't. According to the source's breakdown, Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren are around the limit, while some others are carrying a much bigger problem. Williams, for example, is mentioned as massively overweight, and Red Bull are also described as being in a difficult spot with a car that is still too heavy. That matters because weight is free lap time once you get rid of it. If you're carrying too much mass, you're giving away pace before the driver even reaches the first corner. And if Red Bull are already starting from behind on the chassis side, then every extra kilo makes their situation worse. But the bigger issue is the power unit split. The source argues that Mercedes currently have the benchmark engine. Ferrari are believed to be down on horsepower, possibly by a significant margin, while Red Bull's power unit is being talked about as surprisingly competitive, maybe even the second best on the grid. And that is where the story becomes almost absurd for Red Bull. A yearn because being too close to the front on engine performance could stop them from qualifying for the extra development opportunity that weaker manufacturers may receive. That development system is the key to everything. The way this is presented, the FIA will assess the performance gap between manufacturers, and if an engine is far enough behind the benchmark, that manufacturer can be granted extra freedom to catch up. The thresholds being discussed are essentially tied to how large the deficit is. If you're behind by enough, you get help. If you're too close, you don't. So Ferrari's goal is obvious. They want to be far enough behind Mercedes to qualify for the additional development path, but not so far behind that the season is gone before the upgrade arrives. That's a very delicate place to be. But Ferrari may actually be sitting right there. And if Ferrari do get that opening, it changes the entire mood around their season. Because the source is very clear on one thing. Ferrari's chassis is already seen as highly competitive. If their engine deficit is the main thing holding them back, then an approved development step suddenly makes them dangerous. Not just in isolated races with perfect circumstances, but as a team that could realistically start closing the gap in a meaningful way. By contrast, Red Bull's situation looks much more uncomfortable. Their power unit may actually be one of the success stories here, especially considering how new their project is. But the car itself is being portrayed as the real weakness. The source leans into the idea that Red Bull's chassis is the bigger problem, not the engine. And that creates a brutal scenario. A team with enough engine performance to miss out on extra help, but with a car that still isn't good enough to fight where it wants to be fighting. That's why this matters so much for Max Verstappen too. If Red Bull can't unlock the chassis quickly, and if they also don't get the same development relief Ferrari may receive, then the gap doesn't just stay there, it risks becoming structural. Ferrari would have room to improve one of their main weaknesses, while Red Bull would be left trying to repair the car side of the package under much more pressure. And that takes us back to Antonelli. The source points to Antonelli speaking about Ferrari in a way that strongly suggests they are expected to receive that additional development opportunity. And the exact wording matters because the implication is simple. Ferrari's car is already fast, and if the engine improves, they get much closer. That's the whole story in one sentence. If Antonelli is right, Ferrari are not looking at some vague long-term recovery. They are looking at a realistic path back into the fight once the timing and approvals line up. The likely window discussed is the early European stretch of the season, with races like Barcelona or Austria being the type of period where the impact could start to show. And suddenly the championship picture looks very different. Mercedes stay the benchmark. Ferrari get hope. Red Bull get a major headache. Because if Ferrari really are about to receive the green light to close their engine gap, then their current pace becomes much more threatening than it looks today. And if Red Bull really are just outside the threshold for help, then they could be punished for building a power unit that's decent enough not to qualify, while still dragging around a chassis that doesn't look ready. That is the irony in this whole story. Ferrari may be weak enough in exactly the right area to get help. Red Bull may be strong enough in exactly the wrong area to miss it. And that's why Antonelli's comments matter. Not because they officially confirm anything on their own, but because they point toward the scenario Ferrari fans have been waiting for. A car that already looks competitive, finally getting a shot to fix the one weakness holding it back. If that happens, then Mercedes may not be looking over their shoulders at Red Bull first. They may need to look at Ferrari. So the real takeaway is this. Ferrari's season may depend on whether those engine development opportunities arrive exactly as expected. If they do, this title fight could open up. If they don't, Mercedes remain in control and Ferrari stay stuck needing perfect weekends just to stay close. Either way, Antonelli may have just given away the most important clue yet.